All right, so last I checked, which was a couple hours ago, the group presentation assignments, there are still roughly 12 of us who need to find a group. So that's for the debates, which will unfold for the last 5 weeks of the course or so, once we get into the applied ethical issues, beginning with global economic justice. So there are, of course, 2 groups assigned for each issue. And just to briefly describe how this is going to go again, and this is what we're doing right now with that poll opened up. So you get to pick what issue you want to participate in debating or discussing, but what side you find yourself in your group on will be determined once we get closer to the session, and that will be decided randomly through a kind of virtual coin flip or something. And so this weekend I'll be working on a specific handout and also a rubric to give you some more concrete details and information on what to expect once we get into that in week 6, right? So this is week 4, right? So next week is week 5, and we'll be finishing up this brief foray into the moral theoretical landscape, concluding Monday, so Monday next week, a week from today, with feminist ethics, the ethics of care in particular. And then a week from this Wednesday, we'll have a review session and an opportunity to kind of catch up and wrap up any loose ends. Okay, so are there any questions about any of that for me? And so also for next week, once we're finishing up this unit on moral theory, the midterm exam is also next week. And so that is available starting Sunday night at midnight. So this Sunday night, and it will be open until the following Sunday at midnight. However, I do encourage you to wait until after our Wednesday review session in case you have any questions about it. But you have the whole week to take it. But once you initiate the exam, once you open it up, you'll have 2 hours in which to complete it. Okay, and so that exam will cover the various moral theories that we're unpacking, as well as the preliminary discussions on the history and basis of ethics as a discipline of philosophy and moral reasoning, fallacies, and so forth. And so just keep that in mind for our review session next week on Wednesday, in case you have any questions about any of that material. All right, so are there any questions for me about anything? Any of these administrative issues or the course content or anything like that?
What is the format of the exam and how should we best prepare for it?
Good, it's a good question. So the format is it's composed of, I can't remember the specific number of questions at this point, but there are a fair number of questions, but not enough that you can't manage it within a 2-hour period, because it is covering essentially 6 chapters of material. But the format is, most of the questions are multiple choice, true, false, and there's a handful of short answer questions that are usually presented in the form of a fill in the blank kind of scenario, or asking you to expand in response to a particular question. So there aren't any long essay questions or anything like that. And in terms of those short answer questions, there might be a total of 8 or 10. And so in terms of how to prepare, I would recommend, first of all, using the flashcards that are associated with each chapter and are embedded in Moodle for the different weeks. So use those flashcards to test the adequacy of your understanding of the concepts and other details. And then also use the discussion and comprehension questions that you can find at the end of each chapter in the textbook. That's pretty helpful. And then also, since I've made the various lecture slides that I rely on available in that shared drive, I would recommend, if you haven't already, and you can do this more than once, of course, working through those slides in case, well, the slides have useful information, but they can also, in many cases, direct you to the appropriate area of the relevant chapter where you can find answers to questions that you might have. So I think that's the best way to go about it. Good. Any other questions?
Is it going to be through Moodle?
Yeah. So you'll take
Yeah.
the exam through Moodle. So I'll just share the screen right now so I can, let's see, show you where it is exactly. Yeah, so this is week 5. So for next week, so at the top you have the reading assigned for Monday on feminist ethics. Again, we're having a review Wednesday, so there is no assigned reading. There's still the discussion forum for the week. And then here's where you find the midterm exam. So you click on that. And then yours will look obviously a little bit different, given that I have the instructor's view here, but you'll click on that, and then it'll open you up to the exam. Okay. Does that make sense? Any other questions? And so again, you have the entire week, but I recommend holding off until after our review session next Wednesday. And so that still gives you, between Wednesday and Sunday at midnight to complete it. You are, of course, free to undertake the exam prior to that session. You're free to do so. I wouldn't recommend it. But once you do open the exam, again, you'll have a window of 2 hours in which to finish it. Okay. Any other questions? All right. So we're going to continue today with our little exploration of utilitarian moral philosophy, and then we'll segue into Kantianism. And we'll spend just a little bit of time at the close of the first discussion, the one oriented towards utilitarianism, to talk about social contract theory as well. Okay. So before we jump back into the slides where we left off last time, though, since many of you have expressed an interest in and a fondness for the show, The Good Place, there are a couple of very short videos on YouTube. There's a small handful of these short videos on YouTube associated with The Good Place, and where Professor Todd May, who's a philosophy professor at Clemson University, who is a consultant for the show. He actually uses the show as a launching point to discuss some of these theoretical approaches. So there's one I have pulled up for utilitarianism, and then once we move on to Kantianism, we'll watch that too. So both videos are roughly 4 minutes. They're pretty fun and informative. And the one oriented to utilitarianism takes up the question and problem or the trolley problem, which we started to discuss just a little bit last week. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share the screen, and we'll watch this brief video, and then we'll continue working through utilitarianism. Okay, hopefully, can you all see the screen there? All right.
Oh, God! Michael, what did you do?
My name is Todd May. I teach philosophy at Clemson University. I've been teaching philosophy for about 30 years. Utilitarian philosophy goes back a couple hundred years. Probably the first person really associated with it is an 18th century thinker named Jeremy Bentham. Then it goes up through John Stuart Mill, and it's still very big in philosophy.
Cool.
It's all about the consequences of what you do. It's not about what you intend. It's not about following rules. It's about whatever your action is, right? The world should be a little bit better off when you're done with that action than when you started. For Bentham, it's all a matter of introducing more pleasure into the world than was there before. It's all a matter of suffering and pleasure.
Huh.
The problem is, for a lot of folks, it isn't just about how much pleasure you can get. Let's suppose that I could design a pleasure machine for you. You go into the machine, you'll feel nothing but pleasure for the rest of your life. You won't be doing anything, but it's gonna feel great. Here's the proviso. If you go into that machine, you can't come back out. You'll decide once and for all, would you take the machine? And not many people would take it.
Really? Huh.
When I teach in prisons, one of my classes is a group of lifers, right? They're not going anywhere. They're going to be in that maximum security prison for the rest of their lives. And I've posed the question to them. I had 15 people. And I said, would you take that machine? 14 of them said no, right? Because for all of them, there has to be more to life than just generating pleasure.
This is so interesting.
You can think of utilitarians as not necessarily being about pleasure. We can think, say, of happiness, right, as a broader category. What binds all these together is that for the utilitarian, it's the consequences that count, right? It's not how you get there, it's where you wind up.
I think I'm really starting to get it.
The trolley problem is one of the classic places where people think about utilitarianism and think about whether or not we ought to be utilitarian.
You are driving a trolley, and on the track ahead of you are 5 workmen that you will run over. Now, you can steer to another track, but on that track is 1 person you would kill instead of the 5. What do you do?
Some people think of the trolley problem as a way of defending utilitarianism. Look, if you got to kill 1 person to save 5, that's what you ought to do. So remember in one scene, Chidi's running the trolley.
There are 5 workers on this track and 1 over there. Make a choice.
Quick, Chidi, what's your decision?
I am choosing to switch tracks, so that way I only kill 1 person.
In some ways, and the show brings this out, it's a way of illustrating some of the problems of utilitarianism. In another scene, which comes from philosophy, instead of running over 1 person to save 5, the question is, do you find a healthy person and carve them up in order to use their organs, each one for a different operation?
Dude, what the fork?
These 5 people all need organ transplants or they will die. Eleanor's perfectly healthy. Chidi, do you want to slice her open and use her organs to save the 5 sick people?
People who are willing to throw the switch to kill the one to save the 5 in the trolley problem generally are not going to say, yeah, it's okay to go out in the street and kill 1 person, or to harvest their organs to save 5 other lives.
Although 5 people will die, I cannot harm 1 innocent person to save them. It's unethical.
But then the question then becomes, what's the difference? Utilitarian's going to say it's the same problem, should have the same answer. But right, what Chidi begins to recognize in that actually may not be the same problem for reasons that are difficult to say. One seems obvious to do and the other seems obvious not to do. And for Chidi, this becomes a very difficult thing to sort out.
Oh, come on.
For Jason, I guess the question is, what would Blake Bortles do?
Jacksonville Jaguars rule!
But for Chidi, he's got to think philosophically about this.
Why don't you just tell me the right answer?
I would say that there may be contradictory right answers. That is to say, it's probably at least okay and maybe right to throw the switch. And it's not okay to carve up the 1 to save the 5. But if you ask me, yeah, what's the difference? I don't know what to tell you.
Well, that's good.
All right. Hope you guys enjoyed that. Since we kind of ended with the trolley problem there, and that's more or less where I wanted to jump back into the lecture, what are your thoughts on that? So this is a famous thought experiment in the history of philosophy, proposed first by the moral philosopher Philippa Foot, some of whose work we actually have in primary sources in our textbook. For example, one of the primary source reading materials from chapter 10, the one having to do with physician-assisted suicide, is by Philippa Foot. And as Todd May just explained here, the problem is usually, this thought experiment is usually embraced by philosophers and lay people as exemplary of the efficacy and power that is what's recommendable about utilitarianism, especially given that 3rd criterion that we'll entertain with respect to all of these moral theories. That is exactly how helpful is it when it comes to figuring out difficult problems or adjudicating moral conundrums. But it's also more subtly taken, and this is foregrounded when you expand beyond the traditional trolley problem to consider it in different contextual conditions and details. It can be seen as a means of showcasing issues with utilitarian moral theory. But I'm sure many, if not all of you, have heard of the famous trolley problem before, but what do you guys think about that? This is a good way, based on how you're inclined to respond to this problem as it's presented to you introspectively, to get into a more close and impactful attunement to your own moral intuitions, right? So how you react, how you answer in response to this thought experiment can tell you quite a bit about yourself, perhaps, as a moral agent. Although I tend to think it really tells you much more about the person who put together the thought experiment. I don't find it all that helpful, but other people do. What do you guys think about this thought experiment?
I think it's pretty good. I mean, it definitely pushes you to really think about some things. I don't know if it's the best example, like just in my opinion, because I could see myself in similar questions or experiments, you know, maybe going other routes, depending on really specific, you know, circumstances and whatnot. But in this one in particular, I probably would almost always choose 5 over the 1, save the 1, because I mean, that just makes the most sense, I think. But
Okay. Well,
I've heard some people put a wrench into this and say that, well, what if that one person's a family member or a dear friend or something? And then that complicates the thing.
Yeah, that complicates it. So in the traditional setup of the problem, there is no detail about familiarity or intimacy of relationship or knowledge even at all of the biographical details and so forth of the individuals, because of course, even if you don't know those who are involved, if it turns out that one of those 5 is some important cancer researcher or something, well, that might give you stronger motivation to pull the switch to kill just the one. Whereas if all 5 turn out to be hardened, violent criminals or something, and the one is a cancer researcher or some selfless philanthropist or something like that, well, that might change the dynamic of the moral situation. So then, just like we would have to eliminate the possibility of Hunter's recommendation to just pull the handbrake, because that would to more or less simplify things for us, you have to remove all of those things too, right? So you can't know anything about the individuals. You're dealing purely with numbers, and that makes sense in accordance with utilitarian meta-ethics or moral theory, because here we're considering the individuals who are threatened in this situation as, and this is what we talked about last time, more or less neutral containers of pleasure or displeasure, right? So that's what's relevant, is their capacity to hold and experience pleasure, or contrarily, and this is where badness or wrongness comes from, pain or suffering, right? And there have been different ways to alter the terms or conditions of the thought experiment, sometimes subtle, sometimes dramatic, in an effort to bring out dimensions that are otherwise concealed. And so, as discussed in the video we just watched, so moving from the trolley to a strange operating room where you're asked to give up 5 organs to save the lives of 5 individuals who are dying. So most people would say, well, I wouldn't find that to be moral, even if the individual or subject whose organs would be harvested isn't me or someone that I love. But a different way to stay with the trolley is What if instead of having access to a quick lever, which will divert the trolley to a different track, what if instead of that, to save the 5, you had to, and I didn't create this version, by the way, you had to, standing on top of a train trestle, push an enormous fat man off of the bridge such that his body would fall in the path of the trolley, preventing it from killing the 5, but it would obviously result in his own death. So would you be inclined to push the fat man off the bridge to save the 5 or not? And it turns out, and I might ask you this question, but it turns out that while most people think along utilitarian lines, following that intuition, that it would be the morally right thing to do to pull the lever to divert the trolley, it somehow becomes wrong when instead of just pulling a lever or pushing a button, you actually have to push someone off of a bridge, right? And so that's comparable to some of the tendentious or problematic details that get introduced when we move to that macabre operating room scenario with organ harvesting. So what do you guys think about that? So I see an answer here from Hunter. He says, I would pull the lever but not perform the surgeries due to the circumstance. The pleasure of healing is at the expense of the one who would never have been caused pain unless they volunteer. They are not already destined to end based on the current situation, but if they had cancer that was killing them, but we could harvest their organs to save others, in my eyes, that bridges the gap to put it on the same playing field as the trolley question. But would you still want the person with cancer to consent? Or do you think that would be an unnecessary aspect of this? What do you think, Hunter? Unnecessary, okay. And Connor said, I was actually about to add that. Oh, did I miss something from Noelle? Noelle earlier, sorry, she said, moving the switch is taking action, whereas some people might rather close their eyes and let it hit the 5 people and not take responsibility for either option. And this is a somewhat common reaction to this scenario. What are your thoughts on that? Does anyone agree? But let me see what Connor said in response. If doing neither was an option, then I could see doing neither and just letting.
Yeah, I just agree pretty much.
Okay. But someone like the 20th century existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre would point out that even a non-choice amounts to a choice, right? Actively, that is willfully not pulling the lever when you're aware of the consequences and the circumstances amounts to making a decision, even if it's a decision in which you effectively do nothing. That effective doing nothing is doing something insofar as it plays a role in the eventuality of what is befalling these individuals, right? Does that make sense? So he would call that an act of bad faith, where you are in those few seconds prior to the collision, you're just making the effort to convince yourself that you're morally fine, that it's not your responsibility, you didn't put the people there, but you're actually lying to yourself to cover up your own moral turpitude and failure. Okay. All right, so any other comments or questions on this? All right, so let's jump back into the slides. And once we get past utilitarianism, so we'll take a break shortly, and then there's another video and also an existential comic for Kant that's pretty humorous that we'll talk about. Okay. So, well, let's just start here and then we can move through the trolley problem since we've been talking about it. But this is more or less where we left off last time after pointing out some flaws in Bentham's philosophic calculus or his hedonic calculus. But I should say that it's frequently identified as a criticism of that algorithm or calculus, that in normal circumstances, one doesn't have time to run all of the details of the scenario in connection to oneself and everyone who's possibly impacted through this kind of mechanism, like a computer program. That's implausible to think that people could or would do that. But Bentham actually responded to that critique and said, well, he's through giving this, or in giving the hedonic calculus as a kind of moral decision-making algorithm, he is only laying bare what is, that is making explicit what is implicitly at work whenever we confront such situations or find ourselves in moral difficulty or encountering a question of some kind. And so we tend to make those movements through that calculus, through that framework very quickly without, however, in most circumstances, noticing what we've done or where we're going. Okay. So, but there are some more serious issues as we've seen. So for example, running the scenario of whether or not I should keep or return Jeff Bezos's wallet, it resulted in the conclusion, which by our perhaps typical socially inculcated moral intuitions would appear wrong. That is, as stealing, as a straightforward act of theft. And so that seems to be a problem. But John Stuart Mill or Jeremy Bentham might say in response to that, well, isn't it the task of moral theory, of philosophy in general, to sometimes find flaws with what our basic pre-reflective intuition tells us, right? So it could just be because our culture ingrains in us persistently the moral wrongness of stealing, that we have a hard time figuring out that in a particular situation like the one I laid out last week, it might actually be morally right to do something, which when perceived through that ordinary lens of quite simplified or limited concepts, such as theft and stealing and so forth, it's actually ultimately for the good, it's ultimately for the right. So this is a major issue that especially act utilitarianism seems to conflict with common sense views about justice. So here's a situation that's fairly similar to one Vaughan provides in the textbook in chapter 5. But imagine there's a small town in which a series of murders have taken place over several weeks. And so the town is obviously in the throes of tremendous anxiety. No one's leaving their home. Work isn't getting done. And there is ever increasing pressure on the town's sheriff to find the perpetrator and end the killings. But through much sustained work and investigation, the police, the authorities, the sheriff have no real leads, right? But after the pressure keeps mounting and the town is in a state of tremendous unease or even unrest, the sheriff decides that there's this guy, let's call him Old Man Withers, who is a misanthropic hermit with no family or friends, lives on the outskirts of town, and more people actually dislike Old Man Withers than like him. So the sheriff decides, well, what if I arrest this guy, pin the murders on him, and then I will, alleviate the fear and trepidation of the community. And this is plausible, he thinks, because after a certain period of time, say a few weeks or so, the murders have ceased, right? But the town is still very much nervous because the perpetrator hasn't been found, and so they're afraid that it could begin again. But the sheriff thinks that it was probably just some drifter who at this point has completely moved on and no longer poses a threat to the community. And so the sheriff could tamp down on that anxiety and restore a feeling of security by arresting this guy. So in accordance with act utilitarianism, which says the right or good action is the one which is to maximize or is projected to maximize happiness or pleasure and to mitigate or minimize suffering or pain, this would appear to be the best course of action. But what do you guys think about that? Yeah, free my man Withers. He ain't doing nothing. Yeah, but if you as a citizen don't know any better, you might feel happy, right? So your pleasure has increased. But again, appealing to our ordinary moral intuitions, we at least feel a bit of hesitation, I would suggest, when it comes to approving such an action as morally right. Another issue, and so that has to do with justice, another issue we could consider is one in connection to the category of rights. So one right that we tend to take for granted in our 21st century democratic society is the prima facie right to privacy. So we tend to think that we have a right to privacy. But imagine there's like some creepy motel, like the Bates Motel, where the proprietor has set up hidden cameras in the rooms or in the shower heads or whatever else, but has done so in a sufficiently sophisticated fashion that these viewing apparatuses will never be detected, right? Nobody will ever know. So no one who is a guest in these rooms is aware that anyone is watching them. So nobody is suffering, right? No one has any kind of pain. But the proprietor of the business, on the other hand, well, experiences an overwhelming amount of pleasure at this, at being able to peep at the guests in various states of undress and engaged in strange or ordinary activities or whatever. So then again, similar to the previous scenario, there's a lot of pleasure happening if we understand this to be one of the greatest sources of delight for this particular individual. And comparatively on the other side, there seems to be no pain or suffering or misery occurring. Thus, this very extended or extensive system of peeping, the peeping Tom, would be legitimized as morally okay, right? In fact, even as morally praiseworthy. But clearly, I think perhaps, well, I don't know, hopefully, we would all agree that that's not acceptable, right? Does that make sense though? What do you guys think about that? But, and this connects back to the trolley problem scenario. In terms of the second criterion, and so these are the three criteria that are discussed in chapter 4, so the power of moral theories. This is about consistency with our ordinary moral experiences, right? So we tend to find ourselves in scenarios where it's not immediately obvious or clear what the good act would be, what the adequate response might be. So we often have to question ourselves, right? So utilitarian theory recognizes that and offers us a kind of decision procedure through which to move in order to adjudicate these points of conflict, right? Or to provide resolutions for them. And so it's consistent with utilitarianism that we can sometimes disagree even on what it is that utilitarianism demands with respect to particular situations. Yeah, okay, I agree with Noel, yeah. The peeping Tom should replace Withers. So here's another problem. So utilitarianism, we've already seen, can be understood as useful, right? Insofar as it provides us with a fairly clear standard for determining right and wrong. But act utilitarianism in particular seems to have what theorists or scholars refer to as a no-rest problem, which means that in every moment of our lives, there appears to be always something other than what we're doing that we could be doing in order to maximize the overall public good or the greater good in terms of happiness, right? So who here likes to play video games ever? Who here is a gamer? Anybody?
I'll be a gamer.
All right. So what games do you like to play? Do you have any favorites?
I like to play digital games, but also board games and card games alike. You know?
Cool. So what's a recent game that you played?
I recently played this game called Warhammer.
Oh, I used to play that actually.
Really?
Years and years and years ago. So you're playing Warhammer. Trying to remember the different versions of that game, but it doesn't matter. So you're playing Warhammer. Did it ever occur to you while playing this game that maybe you could have been doing something more worthwhile with your time?
Yes, but the reason I got into it is actually because I didn't have anything better to do. With COVID, I had the time on my hands to get into it.
Okay. Yeah, COVID actually introduces a perhaps unforeseeable monkey wrench in a number of these thought experiments, right? But that's to make it more interesting, perhaps. But so I'm to some extent picking on gamers or those who play video games, but you might have less moralizing objections to one who engages in physical activity if you play basketball or something, because it's conducive to bodily health and so forth. But I could ask the same thing of someone who regularly plays basketball or anything else. Couldn't you be doing something better with your time? And that's even not a very important example or instance for consideration, because we really could turn that question on all of us right now. Morally speaking, aren't there better things we could be occupying ourselves with and committing ourselves to at this very moment than sitting in this weird virtual class and talking about trolleys? Probably, right? And so the no rest problem means that anything you're doing at any time, you could always thematize or come up with, fancifully or ordinarily, anything, any number of things that you could be doing that are that would be put forward to better serve the moral community, right? So this is a problem that John Stuart Mill addresses in his essay Utilitarianism, and he says something like, well, no moral theory will stand up. I'm just paraphrasing him here. You might remember it from the reading. He says something like, no moral theory would stand up or stand these tests or endure through these tests if you presuppose as a background universal stupidity. So in other words, what he's saying is, come on, like we all know that you can't spend every waking moment of your life committing yourself to some project of social betterment, right? Engaging in no rest through maximizing the social good would eventually result in your death or at least something comparable, right? In which case, if you're entirely burnt out, well, then you're not going to be in a position to help anyone at all. That is, to contribute to the overall good, right? So that's one way that some utilitarians have responded to it. And further, to build on John Stuart Mill's response, this is one of the reasons that turned him towards the superiority of rule utilitarianism versus act utilitarianism. So then, for example, rather than focusing all of our moral attention on particular actions that individuals take, we look at and turn this lens towards possible or existing social rules, laws, or norms, which, if held in a society and recognized in place, would be conducive towards the relative flourishing of that society. So then we tend to think, well, there ought to be a time for individuals who are otherwise committed to maximizing the public good. There ought to be time set aside and ought to be perceived as legitimate to use this time set aside for self-improvement, relaxation, enjoyment, and so forth. In a society that denied the efficacy or the sensibility even of such a norm or rule would be a less happy society, right? Does that make sense? And so this is another way that rule utilitarianism is a marked improvement over act utilitarianism, because it allows us to address the no rest problem, but also going back to the previous issues. So for example, the problem with justice. So in a democratic law-governed society, for example, we understand it to be a rule that we can't simply falsely accuse undesirable members of that society in order to achieve otherwise helpful or beneficent consequences, right? So we would consider that a violation of justice. So justice then becomes, and this is the language John Stuart Mill uses, while as a utilitarian, the ultimate end for all of our thinking and decision-making when applied to this moral, ethical, and political domain is happiness or pleasure, we need these sort of intermediate or ancillary rules as signposts, as it were, that one passes and that guides one to the end of happiness as we navigate these various social landscapes. So then we need justice as one of these waypoints or signposts that orients us towards the good, that is towards happiness or pleasure, that we can't as a species obtain it through our various political organizations and structures unless we have rules grounded in the principle of justice. And the same thing goes for certain rights. So then a prima facie right that we all expect, such as that to privacy as private citizens in a democratically governed society, is a good rule, but it's only good not in itself, ultimately, Mill says. It's only good instrumentally because it points to and is conducive to the end of pleasure or happiness. And remember, for all utilitarianism, pleasure and happiness, so happiness understood as pleasure, essentially, is the only intrinsic good. That is a non-instrumental, non-extrinsic good. The ultimate good towards which all intermediate or instrumental goods are oriented and in accordance with which they're identified and recognized as good at all, right? So you remove pleasure or happiness from the equation and whatever it is that's noble or praiseworthy about justice or the recognition of certain rights disappears, right? As a building would disappear without a sound foundation. Okay. So now let's just say a few things. I only have a few slides about social contract theory, and it is a version of consequentialism in that it takes moral goodness, badness, rightness, and wrongness to be an effect of consequences which can either be facilitated or negatively conditioned by existing and transformed social structures. And so all of these existing or incrementally transformed social structures have at their basis this kind of abstract, implicit social contract. And so I think I mentioned this last time that social contract theory provides the philosophical conceptual basis for our own system of government, right? For democracy as such, although tracing it back to Thomas Hobbes, there's nothing essential about the social contract doctrine which necessitates that it be democratically applied. So Thomas Hobbes, for example, thought that even a monarchy could really be supported by and made sense of, in fact, legitimized through the conceptual framework of the social contract. And so one of Thomas Hobbes's greatest contributions to the history of ethical philosophy was to decouple authority, social and political authority, from any kind of inherent divine providence, right? So think of, for example, the old notion of the divine right of kings, in accordance with which a monarch or a sovereign could do whatever the fuck he wanted to the people, because that individual's authority was undergirded by divine sanction. And that's something that no one can disagree with. So Thomas Hobbes, back in the 17th century, operating still under a monarchy, but facing the violence of a dramatically unfolding and extremely destabilizing civil war at this time in Great Britain, he said, no, the only reason that these monarchs or these authorities have the power that they do is because we the people, so notice that language, is because we the people at some point banded together and decided to give up to some extent our natural rights of self-governance as a free gift of sorts to the sovereign authority whose power would ultimately prevent the most destructive ravages of our essential animal impulses, which for Hobbes amounted to avarice or greed and the lust for power, right? And also on the other side, so greed, avarice, lust for power, and concomitantly, at the same time, fear, right? And so if you understand it to be a part of human nature, that every individual is driven by greed and the desire for power, well, this might make you fearful in a group, right? So it's these twin emotional sources of greed, competitiveness, and fear that drive the orientations that we take in the pursuit of good standards for governing our moral lives. So here's an image of Thomas Hobbes, who back again in the 17th century theorized this mythical state of nature, which he characterized in this famous line. So the state of nature before human beings entered a social contract. In the state of nature, life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And so according to Hobbes, there are all these fundamental laws of nature and also one fundamental right of nature. And these exist independently of any social structure. And in fact, prior to individuals' entry into given social organizations. So then what is the fundamental law of nature for Hobbes? Well, it's to pursue peace and to keep it to whatever extent one is possible or one is capable of in a particular social context. So this presupposes, of course, the willingness of others within that context to also pursue and try to keep peace. And so the flip side of the coin of this fundamental law of nature is the fundamental right of nature. And the fundamental right of nature, which cannot be entirely abrogated even in an existing society, right? So we all ultimately have recourse to this fundamental right of nature in Hobbes, even while existing or living in a given social setting. But this fundamental right of nature is to do whatever you think is necessary. So whatever you, as an existing individual, perceive as necessary to preserve your life and to ensure its continuance. And that's very vague, but that's the point. And that's why this right of nature, and we tend to think of rights as good, but what Hobbes is articulating here is something really dangerous about that. If before there is any universal or central sovereign authority to adjudicate matters of justice, of right and wrong, every person in this so-called state of nature has the right to do whatever the hell they think is necessary to preserve their own lives, well then people are gonna find themselves doing some pretty crazy shit. So imagine you're in this state of nature and you're just sort of moving around trying to find your next meal, and well, let's say that you've amassed some reserve of acorns, right? You found a great tree and you've put together this huge pile of acorns and you're guarding it, and then you see over the hill some guy walking around. He looks pretty suspect. Maybe he happens, but you're not sure, maybe he happens to glance over at you for a second and you think, that guy's going to try to steal my acorns. So what do? You pick up a huge rock, you hide behind a tree, you wait for him to come by, and you smash his head in, right? Hobbes would say that's perfectly rational and totally within your right. But that doesn't make it good, right? That's why life in the state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And Hobbes is actually the one who first expressed and gave definition to something that we all take for granted now, the notion of universal human equality. And that's a basic principle that will remain in the background for all of these discussions that we have from here forward. Universal human equality is an essential principle for ethical discourse. It's ineliminable. It's absolutely pivotal. But what exactly did he mean by that? That all humans are equal? Well, as is to be expected with a rather dark figure like Hobbes, according to Hobbes, we are all fundamentally equal precisely in our capacity to kill each other. That's what makes us equal. So sure, you might be physically more robust or capable. You might be stronger, which means that, of course, you might think you could kill me more easily. But what if I'm more clever, right? What if I'm more intelligent? Well, then I can get the upper hand on you, even if I happen to be comparatively impoverished in terms of my physical prowess. But what if you're both physically weak and stupid? Well, then surely you're not equal. Well, Hobbes would say, even if you're the smartest, most competent, or strongest person in the world, you still have to sleep, right? So when you are, as the strongest or smartest person alive, asleep, well, the weak and dumb person can just smother you, right? So we can all, as the case may be, given our own peculiar talents and background, we can all shore ourselves up in this sort of neutral state of nature to achieve advantage over others, right? And so this makes it incredibly dangerous and competitive. So then, according to the first law of nature, we ought to all, to some extent, again, not entirely, this is impossible, he thinks, give up some of that fundamental right to some neutral third party, whom he called the Leviathan, following the language of the Bible, that would guarantee the at least stability, if not flourishing, of this particular state. And so, according to Hobbes, matters of good and bad derive from, and this is what puts him into some alignment with utilitarianism, good and bad arise because of our capacities of experience as animals for pleasure and pain. If there were no pleasure and pain, he thinks there would be no good and bad. But justice has to be constructed on a more or less artificial social basis. So justice only happens when there is some sovereign authority who is there as the teeth, as it were, behind the different laws that a given community decides upon through a social contract. So before there is some power to punish, there is, strictly speaking, according to Hobbes, no such thing as justice. So this is why the sovereign has to be absolute in his or her authority. Because above all else, Hobbes was concerned with preserving stability and harmony. Okay. But there's some last considerations. Here's some positive aspects. So social contract theory gives reason to believe that morality is objective because it consists of rules that the members, all of whom are considered rational, of society have determined to be beneficial for the group as a whole. Also, when it comes to the usefulness of the theory, there's little difficulty in figuring out when injustice has taken place, because by definition, injustice is simply the violation of an established law or rule. And the establishment of this law or rule is protected by the presumed authority to punish of the sovereign, to whom the collective as a whole has given up some of their natural right. But there are some problems. So you might think, well, I never consented to this so-called social contract. I never signed anything. So how is it that I'm beholden to these laws? Well, to get around that, Hobbes said that, well, this is an implicit social contract. So the very fact that as an adult citizen of a given political state or society, you choose to remain in that state or society, well, that's sufficient evidence of your agreement to the terms of the contract. That is, if you didn't want to be party to such a contract, well then, as an adult, you would freely leave its kind of purview, right? But of course, that might sound plausible in theory or abstractly, but obviously it's quite difficult to just decide to leave a lawful or legally sort of established or supported society for the open wilderness, right? That doesn't seem like a viable option for us. So it's not entirely satisfying. But another issue, social contract theory holds that only individuals who have moral status are those who can legitimately be party to a social contract. And the ones who can participate in a social contract are those for whom participation would be mutually beneficial. But then the question becomes, how does one achieve moral status? Right? What does it really mean to be a moral agent, to have autonomy as a precondition for recognition and entry into a contract? Well, that's an issue, because those who are so vulnerable or disadvantaged, such as I name them here, the elderly, the disabled, chronically ill, or children, for example, or non-human animals, right? Non-human animals are incapable of participating in the sort of robust language or discourse that gives rise to contractual details and distinctions that one could commit oneself to, right? So those who don't participate in discourse, then, it seems, cannot be moral agents and hence cannot be party to any social contract, which means that their voice isn't heard or even consulted when it comes to figuring out the terms of this social contract. So that can be a major issue. But all right, so that's all I had for the chapter 5 discussion. So are there any lingering comments or questions about that, either utilitarianism or social contract theory, based on what we just went through? So what do you guys think of of those theories? Do you like social contractarianism? Do you think it's good? I mean, that's really the world we're living in to some extent. That's the conceptual history and background that has informed our existing social structure, right? So it's really hard to make sense of our reality as in some way outside of that social structure with which we're all familiar, and that tends to mirror ourselves back to ourselves. But of course, Hobbes was only the first step in the so-called social contract tradition. Following him, philosophers like John Locke, and also in England, Jean-Jacques Rousseau in France, Immanuel Kant too was a contributor to this dialogue, would have major objections and offer various improvements, right? But we don't really have time to necessarily get into all of that. But are there any final comments or questions about that? All right, so let's then take a quick break, just a few minutes, and then we'll come back and jump into Kantianism. Kant is incredibly complex and difficult, and I know I've, in some situations, complained about Louis Vaughan, our textbook writer, and here is another one of those situations. I think his treatment of Kant is pretty poor. I don't think he gives Kant the best shake, and he identifies problems which are not really problems. And Kant, and I'm not even a Kantian, right? I disagree with Kant, but I don't think he gives the best account. So I'll have to push back on some of the issues that Vaughan raises with respect to deontology. So we'll do that today as well. So there's a lot to work through with Kant, so we'll have to carry this over, I'm sure, for Wednesday before digging into virtue ethics. But let's just take a few minutes break, and then we'll come back and talk about Immanuel Kant. So I'll see you guys in just a minute.